Warmest greetings, everybody. I think it's approaching the 7 o'clock hour now. Time for us to begin this little presentation. A presentation entitled, "What time is it? The future is Africa." We're in the throes of what we're told is a pandemic at the moment. And I can see there are people trying to communicate with me. I hope that things are working out technically. Because we are in this pandemic situation, at least we're told we're in a pandemic situation at the moment. The people assisting are not in the studio. So I'm afraid I won't be in a position to answer phone calls. Even when it comes to the question and answer section, the way we're going to do it within the circumstances is for people to write their questions up, make their comments on the actual YouTube channel. And we will have one of our members relay those questions to me live on air, or reload those comments to me live on air. So we're having to improvise. We're doing our best with the improvisation as things stand at the moment. I can only hope that everybody is picking it up clearly. The monitors that I have in the studio are indicating that the signal is going out with relative clarity, and it may be that the drum is overshadowing my voice a little bit, and so perhaps what I can do at this stage is just bring the drum to a close. But it's definitely past 7 o'clock now, and time for us to begin. That drum that we started off with, by the way, is part of our tribute to our ancestors. Many of us have seen our loved ones cross to meet the ancestors during the past few months. I'm no exception to this. I have family and friends who have crossed to meet the ancestors. I want to this time remember my uncle, whose picture is by my side, on my right-hand side. Ru Pert-em-Hru. Crossed to meet the ancestors recently. I want to remember our brother Dougie Williams, Dougie, who crossed to meet the ancestors recently. And I also want to acknowledge Sister Decca, one of our sisters who crossed to meet the ancestors very recently, and I've just learned today that tonight is her 9 night. And so she, of course, is in my thoughts also. But we want to remember all of our loved ones who crossed to meet the ancestors during what we're told is a pandemic. Acknowledging that we, African people, here in Britain and other parts of the diaspora, have been more affected by this than any other people. And when we do a relative comparison with the volume of deaths in Africa and the volume of deaths in places where we are in the majority, like the Caribbean, for instance, we see that racism must be a factor in the high death toll that we're suffering in places like Britain. They can't tell us that it's not racism, and we must busy ourselves telling them that it is. Asheo. Let me just put the drum back there. And let me just say warmest greetings to everybody. In case you were not hearing me clearly whilst the drumming was going on, this evening is going to be a presentation. It's our African Liberation Day presentation. There were technical problems when we tried to deliver the presentation last time. We hope we've resolved those technical problems. So it's our African Liberation Day 2020 presentation that will be happening today. It is entitled, "What Time Is It?" And Africa is the future, or the future is Africa. So you can see it's essentially in two parts. And one of the things that we did is we issued part one early. But before we go on to looking at the presentation, just a word of thanks to supporting organizations. Naturally, we give a thank to Ukombozi, one of the supporting organizations. We give thanks to Sankofa 360 Limited, another of the supporting organizations. We give thanks to Make Our Money Matter. We give thanks to Black Open University. We give thanks to the Reggae exhibition. We give thanks to Kwanzaa Network UK. Of course, we give thanks to the Pan-Afrikan Society Community Forum. And we give thanks to DOPA, which is the directory of Pan-Africa. All of these organizations, all of these entities have come forward to support this presentation. So just to give an outline of what we're going to try to do today, very briefly look at the question, what is time? And that was the section that we posted out before, so we won't be spending much time on that explanation. And if you want a deeper explanation of what time actually is, then you can go to our YouTube channel. Our YouTube channel is Ukombozi space PASCF. It's written here. Ukombozi space PASCF. Ukombozi is spelled UKOMBOZII-PASCF. If you go to our YouTube channel, click on there, you'll see that we've got a presentation on there, short presentation on there, which explains what time is, and it's entitled, "What is Time?" So if you haven't seen that already, because I'm not going to spend much time on this section, you can go back and look at that. We're then going to go on to just outline the traits of successful people. We want to be a successful people. We're looking in visionary terms. We're looking forward. We're looking for progress. We're looking to become better and stronger as a nation. And a nation relies on its people. This is its most important ingredient, qualitative ingredient. And so we're going to look at how successful people manage time and tools manage space as well. But we're going to look at the most potent tool of the phase of history that we've been in for over 100 years, industrialization. So the Industrial Revolution marked the beginning of industrialization. It marked the beginning also of capitalism, of course. Industrial Revolution is code word for the beginning of capitalism. We're going to talk very briefly about what I'm going to just describe here as the new revolution, the phase of history that we're in now, and what lessons perhaps we can learn from the phase of history that we've been in for the past 100 years. And then we're going to just put down some markers to indicate not just the possibility, but the prospect of success for African people. We are at the launch pad, I'm going to suggest, of coming into our greatness. Many of us haven't seen the factors that are coming together. We're probably aware of them, but we haven't kind of put them together to try and make sense of them in order to help us to plan and galvanize and organize and move towards a successful future. So I'll just talk briefly on some of the factors that are going on at the moment that we have in our favor. So, and just to say, I'm just going to be skimming over briefly over the top of these subjects because we could be here speaking for a long time, so it's not my intention to go into great depth in these particular subjects. So, what is time? In the presentation that you can go and look at on our YouTube channel, we explain that time is the movement of material. It is the measurement, in fact, of the movement of material. So as the material world moves, we measure it. We measure the rotation of the Earth. We measure the moon's rotation around the Earth. We measure the Earth's rotation around the sun. And this gives us indicators that we can use as yardsticks to measure time. So time is the measurement of the movement in material things. And what that means is that history, for instance, is the record of the movement in material things. When we understand that, we can get a better understanding of history. But as I said, I'm not going to spend much time on this. And the other thing to understand about time is it must be understood in relation to space. Time does not stand alone. It stands in relation to space. Space being essentially volume, the third dimension. And when you put time and space together, and the other dimensions which go beyond the fourth dimensions. Time is the fourth dimension, space is the third dimension. And the dimensions beyond that can be proved to be inside time and space. And when you put all of that together, what you have is nature. So there's a relationship between time, space, and nature. Nature can be also described as the universe. It's the same thing, essentially. It can also be described as matter in its entirety. Again, it's the same thing. So let me leave that subject and move on to the traits of successful people. One of the traits of successful people is they manage time effectively. And how do successful people manage time? Well, they recognize that time has the past, the present, and the future, first of all. That's the first thing you've got to recognize. You can't limit yourself to being just in the present, even though we're physically in the present. You can't limit yourself to being just in the past. In fact, you can't even be in the past because the past is already gone. You can't limit yourself to just, trying to be in the future. Now, physically, we can only be in the present. But mentally, we have the capacity to go back into the past in order to take lessons from the past and bring them into the present. We also have the mental capacity, even though physically we're in the present, to project into the future and to make some kind of guess, if you like, of what may happen in the future, and to make plans as to what will happen in the future. And so at the broadest level, in terms of interfacing and interacting with time, successful people are those who are able to go into the past. They're able to draw the lessons from the past and bring them into the present and work on them, act on them to improve their situation. Successful people also have the capacity to go into the future and draw from the future and bring that into the present and work on that and act on that. You might ask the question, well, how can you go into the future? Well, remember, we can't physically go into the future, but mentally we can project into the future. And one way of projecting into the future is the idea of visioning, to create a vision of the future that you desire. And as a people, if you're able to create a vision of the future that you desire, then you can begin to come back from there. You can begin then to identify the aims that will take you towards that vision. You'll be able to identify the objectives that take you towards the aims that take you towards that vision. You'll be able to identify the targets, the immediate things that you've got to do that take you towards the objectives, which take you towards your aims, which take you towards your vision. In other words, successful people plan for the future, and they plan the type of future that they are looking for. But so this is the way to draw the future into the present and work with it in the way that we can draw the history from the past into the present and work on it. So this is the time management trait of successful people. We have a history which shows that we are the greatest planners, but our history has been interrupted by colonialism, slavery, colonialism, and neocolonialism. And our ability to plan has been hampered. So we must regain that ability to plan, which implies that we must go into our past, check out our mistakes. History is important. Learn from those mistakes and build those corrections to those mistakes into our plans for success into the future. So that's a point on the trait of successful people in relation to time. The trait of successful people in relation to time links very much into tools. So I've written tools here. And I'm going to give you an example of the importance of tools. If you imagine that each human being, each person, you have a person, that says person, I'm not sure how clear that comes out. Each person also has labor. So you have a person, each person has labor, and in addition to labor, I'll put another plus here, labor is enhanced by tools. So I'm just doing an equation here. You have the person, each person has labor, we do certain things to make our lives better and make our communities better, make our nations better, make the world better. And sometimes it can be used negatively to make the world a worse place, for ourselves or people around us. But we'll work on the notion that our objective is to make the world better. So person plus labor and tools. And tools have a powerful impact on our ability to to change the world. So for instance, I want to imagine I'm a human being, and without tools, I decide I want to make my way. I don't know. I'm in London right now. Make my way to Scotland, and I start walking. That's my body is my tool. So I walk in a day. How long will I? How far will I get? Maybe about 20 miles in a day. If I'm a brisk walker and I don't hurt myself, don't get injured, I can maybe do 20 miles in a day. But if you give me a tool, perhaps I can do better. So imagine that you give me a tool called a bicycle. And instead of walking, I used a bicycle. Now, all of a sudden, in a day, maybe I can do 60 miles a day. It's probably more than 60 miles, but let's just say 60 for argument's sake. So it's the same person, but that person is now able to do 60 miles in a day, and the difference is the tool. The tool is making the person more productive. Now, imagine that I decide that the bicycle is not good enough. And I decided I want a better tool. Well, I might have a motor car. Now, the motor car will take me even further. Maybe in a day, driving a motor car, maybe I can expect to travel 600 miles. It's the same person, a slightly different use of labor, maybe, but the tool has enhanced my ability to maybe make it to Scotland in a day. But let's imagine that I've decided that that tool, the motor car, is not good enough. Well, another tool might be an airplane. And if I can get on an airplane from London to Scotland, I can get to Scotland in probably 1 hour. Possibly, in fact, I've flown it. It is just about an hour from London to Scotland. Alternatively, I could probably fly around the Earth once in a day. 24,000 miles. I could probably do an airplane non-stop. Could probably do that in a day. So again, the tool enhances the ability of the person. Same person, but the tool has now enhanced the ability of the person to travel. Now, if I decide an airplane is not good enough, I might decide I want a spaceship. And I don't know how far the spaceship will take me, maybe to the moon in a day. I think when they went to the moon, it took them a few days. So, maybe a third of the way to the moon in a day. Again, now we're talking about many, many thousands of miles, maybe many tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of miles. Same person, but with the tool, the better quality tool, you can achieve more. And it's very important to understand that production, our ability to produce, is enhanced by the quality of tools that we have available to us. Very, very important to understand that point. Now, moving on from that point, so the effective people here draw from the past into the present and act on it. They draw from the future into the present and act on it. And the successful people here in space, so that's time, in space, the successful people are the ones who produce the most efficient and effective tools in order to enhance their labor, in order for them to be able to build a better future, hopefully for themselves, their families, their communities, their nations, the world, etc., etc. Now, what happened recently, what happened in the last, say, 150 or so years, is there was an industrial revolution. The industrial revolution led to industrialization. Now, industrialization has been the most potent tool that humanity has had in that period. It came about as a result of the enslavement of African people. That's what brought it into existence. African people were enslaved. Our labor was stolen. It built up masses and masses of wealth for people here in Britain. Now, we're talking about the upper classes here in Britain, but also the ordinary people in Britain benefited. All the buildings that went up, for instance, all the jobs that they got, etc., etc. So they all benefited, but the upper classes in particular took the lion's share for themselves. So the industrial revolution was financed through the massive profits that were made from the blood, sweat, and tears of African people enslaved in the Americas, particularly in the Caribbean islands. And so they were able to take that, and they were able to create inventions, things like the spinning jenny. When when you're in primary school, they teach you about the spinning jenny. They don't teach you that it was created out of the blood, sweat, and tears of African people, but they teach you about these things, and they boost themselves, make the British appear to be some kind of wonderful set of genius people, and then the idea is that all other people are stupid by comparison. Now, just very quickly, let me say this, that the advanced situation that Europeans have found themselves in the world has nothing whatsoever to do with intelligence. This is a complete misnomer. It has everything to do with the tools. That's what the explanation was just showing us. It has everything to do with the quality of tools. They come to Africa with Gatling guns, machine guns. We have shields, we have spears. Yeah, the shields don't stop bullets. They win the war. That's nothing to do with intelligence. Yeah, that's to do with they've used one set of Africans to build up their wealth, to create the infrastructure that allows them to come to the mainland of Africa in order to usurp it, to steal it, to take it over. So the point that I'm making very quickly is that it's nothing to do with intelligence. They bring out all this IQ stupidness, the scientific racists try and make out that they're more intelligent. Absolutely nothing to do with intelligence, all to do with them having more effective tools. And what happened is when they developed industrialization, they specifically denied the rest of the world access to it. And in particular, they denied Africa access to industrialization. So when you saw them bomb Iraq, when Saddam Hussein was the leader of Iraq, Iraq was industrializing. And so what they did is they bombed it to prevent it from industrializing, because if it industrializes, it comes onto a par with the European nations and their infrastructure. So we can see an example in the world right now, or we can see examples in the world right now. China has nuclear weapons. They can't just go and bomb China in the way that they did to somewhere like Iraq. China just got industrialized yesterday, by comparison, and already the Chinese people are outperforming the Europeans just basically because they now have tools which are of an equivalent standard. and their work standards, their ability to work, is outstripping Europe by far. It makes you wonder what will happen when African people industrialize, which is one of the things that we have to do. We haven't got a choice, we've got to do that. But the world is organized in a way to ensure that Africa does not industrialize. So this is one of the objectives that we have got to we've got to achieve. But whilst we're seeking to achieve that objective, there's another change going on, and that change links into the computer age. So we can see now that we're going through a period of rapid change, where computers are increasingly becoming well, not only more powerful, but having power over the lives of human beings. The tools, we're reaching a point where the tools are now becoming, in some respects, more powerful than the person. But the tools are more brainy than the people. The tools during industrialization were physically stronger than the people. So this is how construction and all those kinds of things happened, working with steel that we can't manipulate with our hands, but we can use tools to manipulate. But now the brain side of tools is reaching, or has reached, a level which is comparable to the best brains of human beings. And so now we have a situation where the tools potentially could control human beings. Now, so this is underpinning what is existing at the moment. Now, there's a lot of information going on around this, and I'm not going to go into any depth. If you're a part of any WhatsApp group, you'll be getting information left, right, and center, with people sharing theories as to the meaning of the changes that are going on. And I'm not going to go into the detail of that discussion. What I'm actually going to do is I'm just going to speak finally to the factors which I'm going to suggest are indicators of the success that awaits Africa. There are a number of things. Demographics, the population, study of population helps us here. Africa currently has a population of 1.3 billion people. 1.3 billion people in Africa. So it's a massive population. It's the other places in the world with massive populations are India and China, both with equivalent populations, slightly bigger than Africa as things stand at the moment. Europe and the Americas have very small populations, relatively speaking. Successful nations have large land masses and large populations. This is what we can see. We can look at, for instance, Russia, relatively large population, but large land mass. If you look at India, large population, large land mass. China, large population, large land mass. You go into North America, you find relatively large land masses and relatively large populations, and so on. So there's a correlation between large populations and large land masses. In Africa, we have a large land mass. We have a large population, but that population has been artificially divided to think that it is not one population. And so this is one of the methods that's been used to hold us back. But anyway, if we sweep aside, for the time being, the divisions that have been put between us, then we recognize that there are 1.3 billion of us in our motherland. There are there are another 3 100 million or so of us in the diaspora. You can say between 300 and 400 million African people in the diaspora. So what we're talking about is a global population in excess of 1.6 billion African people on Earth. So we are ready with a large population physically. Even if we don't know what we're doing, physically we're ready with a large population. But there's more in the demographic figures that we've got to understand. Africa has an advantage in terms of its population size over Europe, over the Americas, and not so over India and China. But it has, within that demographic, an advantage over both India and China also, and everywhere else in the world. And what it is, it's about age. The average age of African people on the continent of Africa is 18. It may be shifting a little bit to 19 now. But the average age of people on the African continent is 18. Think about that. Think about that. Yeah. So between 18 and 30, we can think of that as the reproduction phase. The phase at which young adults begin to create their families. And Africa is at the beginning of that, with one of the largest populations in the world already. And so what is going to happen in Africa is young women and men are going to come together, and they are going to create an even greater population, a massive population. Now, our average age is way below China. Our average age is way below India. These are old populations in comparison to us. And so our reproduction rate is already outstripping them and will continue to outstrip them. And as we outstrip them, what will happen is the African population will grow and continue to grow, whilst the Indian and Chinese population begin to shrink. So they're in the process of shrinking relative to Africa. So much so that some of the projections, when you project into these figures into the future, projections show that at the end of this century, we're in 2020 now, by the time we reach 21, the projections say that half of the children in the world between 0 and 4 years of age will be African. So we're moving into a world where half the population will be African. We should now understand why there are forces so determined to kill us in massive numbers. We should now be clearer on why these plans exist to stop us from reaching our natural position. So we hear all kinds of stories about vaccines and the dangers of vaccines. But there are real things that have happened. And some of those real things, if you look in Africa's history over the past 50 or so years, you'll see that we have been badly affected by wars, what on the face of it look like internal wars. In the Congo, estimates of between 6 and 10 million people killed as a result of war. In the Sudan, estimates of 5 million people killed in Anyanya 1 and Anyanya 2, which were war number 1 and war number 2. In Rwanda, there was the genocide in Rwanda with estimates ranging from 800,000 right the way up to 3 million in some cases. In Uganda, there was a war which resulted in the loss of 1 million lives. In Sierra Leone, 300,000 lives. We can go round the continent And it's been, ours has been a continent besieged by war. We have been attacked using AIDS. AIDS infected our continent and wiped out many of our people. We have been attacked with Ebola. Ebola has come and wiped out many of our people. But the news for us is this. The news for us is this. The demographic news for us is this: is despite the best or worst efforts of imperialism to wipe us out through the creation of proxy wars, to wipe us out through the spreading of vicious diseases in our land amongst our people, etc. Despite all of this, we continue to multiply. We continue to grow. Our population continues to grow and continues on a path to becoming the world's largest population. We must understand what that means. You see, the first part of the success is that we have shown ourselves to be indestructible. Yes, you can kill us off one here, one there. Yes, you can kill us off 1 million here, 1 million there. But somehow we continue to manage to multiply. And yes, the plans to kill us off will continue. And we must defend ourselves robustly against the agendas that try to kill us off. Obviously, we must do that. But we must also understand the success that we've had even in the period of adversity. And we must also understand that the attempts to wipe us out, the attempts to cull us in large numbers have been made whilst we were at our weakest. This is the weakest that we have been these past, 200, 300, 400 years, is the weakest that we've ever been in Africa in relative to the rest of the world. And if they couldn't wipe us out when we were at our weakest, they will not be able to wipe us out as we increase in strength. So we must now come to that understanding. We must now appreciate our power as African people. When we're disempowered, they cannot eliminate us. We must understand this and what it means. Now, our future population is going to be a population of children. It's going to be a population of young people. And we come back to the tools again. Because who are the people who best understand computers? Who are the people that best understand mobile phones? My grandchildren understand mobile phones better than I do. They're way ahead of me. And the predictions for Africa, and it's already started, is that Africa is going to be a continent of young people. So when it comes to the mastering of the new tools, who are going to be the people to master the new tools? In terms of knowledge, it will be African people who will be the masters of the new tools. And we must prepare ourselves to become the masters of the new tools. And when we do become the masters of the new tools, and there isn't time to go into how we plan, etc., to do this, but we know that in the demographics, we know that it's coming. Yeah. And when we become the masters of the new tools, the computers, the artificial intelligence, and all the other things that they've got up their sleeve, which they will not be able to hold on to or keep us away from. When we become masters of that, our duty will be to use that capacity to make the world a better place for African people and others. So we're not selfish. We're not trying to just grab for ourselves and to hell with everybody else. This is not the African way. But we must have what is ours. And this is what Garvey reminds us. Garvey reminded us of this, Nkrumah also reminded us of this, that Africa is ours. And this brings us to the third factor. When you add to the demographics, the third factor is that those 1.3 billion African people that I mentioned a little bit earlier, and that number is going to multiply, are standing on the richest land in the world. Africa is by far the richest land in the world. It's got more gold than anywhere else. It's got more diamonds than anywhere else. You know, if you want to make nuclear weapons, where do you have to go for the uranium? Basically, you have to go to Africa to get the uranium. And in the soil of Africa are minerals beyond the imagination. In fact, in the soil of Africa is the coltan that's used to make computers, to make mobile phones. That's where you have to go to get it, to Africa. So you can see how the future is actually in Africa, both in terms of the nature, the soil of Africa, and it's also in African people. And when you combine those things, what you have is a brilliant future for Africa. But we have to solve a number of problems. And one of those problems is that other people control Africa. The Europeans have been in control of Africa for the past 150 or so years. That is what makes them the most powerful people in the world at the moment. And when I say Europeans, I'm talking about those in North America who stole the land of the American Indians. I'm talking about those in Australia who stole the land of the Aborigines. They are all Europeans. They've just stolen other people's lands and have occupied those other people's lands. So Europeans have been the most powerful people in the world for the last couple of hundred years, based on the blood, sweat, and tears of African people. And all other nations are beginning to realize that if you want to be a superpower, you must either control Africa or at the very least have a stake in Africa. So this is why the Chinese are coming into Africa and redoubling their efforts to gain as much of our resources as they can. We don't hear as much, but India is coming into Africa and again trying to get as much of our resources as they can. Arabia is coming into Africa and trying to get as much of our resources as they can. So we've got strange arrangements in Africa at the moment, where the land of Africa is being used to grow food, not for African people, but solely for export to Arabia, for instance. Yeah, we've got a strange situation where the water under the Sahara, there are masses of fresh water underneath the Sahara, is being piped to Italy, for instance. Yeah, so we've got all of these strange things happening, which we must stop and we must bring under our control. And when we control Africa, the only people with a legitimate right to control Africa and the resources of Africa are African people. And when we do that, and when we organize ourselves with a plan into the future, having learned the lessons from our past, when we organize ourselves effectively, we will then be in a position to control our own resources, to build ourselves back up to where we should always have been. This is the real reparations, by the way. To repair ourselves, when people talk about internal repairs, what I hope they mean is to take control of that which is naturally ours, our God-given gift, our land, our people are also, and with this new generation of young people that we can expect throughout the whole of the rest of this century. And when we organize that effectively, we will make Africa powerful again. It will not just be powerful, it will be the most powerful nation in the world. the most powerful nation in the world. And when we become the most powerful nation in the world, we will not use our power to hold other people back. We will not use our power to destroy other people's lives. We will use our power to make the world a better place. And so the two things, essentially two things that we must do to put ourselves in that position of power is, one, we must unite Africa. It sounds like a cliche, but it's true. The 55 so-called states, what I call the jigsaw puzzle states, must be eliminated and one unified Africa brought into being. And that will be the first step, the political step to correcting our situation. And then the second step, which will catapult us into pole position in the world, which will make us the most powerful people in the world, will be to embrace industrialization. We have to embrace industrialization. We can't turn our back on it. It is here. We're going to have to embrace the new technology that comes along. We can't turn our back on it. It is here. What we're going to have to do is use those technologies in a way that enhances nature and does not damage and destroy nature. We're going to have to use those technologies in a way that enhances human and other life on the planet and does not destroy human and other life on this planet. Now I'm going to stop there and I'm going to open up for questions. So we have a member of our team who is reading the messages that are being posted up. And if you have any questions or comments that you'd like to make, please, type them up. You may have typed some up already, and our member who is monitoring those questions will then put those questions to me, and I'll do my best to respond to that. So I'm just awaiting a phone call now. When that phone call comes, I'm hoping that it will bring with it a number of questions. And I suppose what I can do in the meantime is maybe just beat a little bit of drum whilst this is being orientated. So let me see. Well, I do hope that that is going out, and it's going out clearly. And just to allow our members who are dealing with that part to, to orientate themselves, let me just beat a little bit of drum. I thank you all for listening. I hope I didn't go on for too long. The idea was not to go into a lot of detail, but to give people some gist, a sense of the position that we're in at the moment and the strength of the position that African people are in at the moment. And if we understand how powerful we are, this may help us to make some of the decisions that we need, correct decisions, in order to regain our power. A power which has been undermined for, in some instances, 500 to 600 years. In other instances, 1.3 to 1.4 thousand years. Okay, I'm not. A call hasn't come through, so I can only presume from that something is coming through. Just bear with me a moment, please. Just bear with me whilst I position everything appropriately for us to be able to communicate with each other effectively. Let me say warmest greetings to you, my sister. Do you have any comments to share, comments or questions to share?
Greeting everyone, greetings. Currently, unfortunately, no questions came through.
Okay.
But I have a question myself, actually. We in the diaspora, what do you recommend us to do? You spoke a lot about the people on the continent, obviously us here in the West. What can we do to participate into that plan that you just outlined?
Okay. So it's a very general response that I can give, that I'll give to that, because we can't necessarily discuss specifics in open forums. The idea is really that we join organizations that are genuinely working towards the liberation of our people. That's essentially what we must do. We must join organizations that are genuinely committed to the liberation of our people, and we must work to make those organizations successful. And we must do our best to ensure that those organizations adopt the traits of successful people that I tried to outline, the traits of successful nations, etc. that I tried to outline. So those of us in the diaspora have got a particular role to play. And if you look at the way that the battle against the enslavement of our people panned out, the main victories were by the African people who were enslaved. That's where the main victories happened. Yeah, but there were also victories in places like Britain, for instance. And so you had an anti-slavery movement here in Britain. And when we examine that honestly from an historical vantage point, what we see is African people found their way to England somehow. Some of them escaping from enslavement, others maybe who had bought their freedom and got here, others who were held in bondage here, in a kind of slavery bondage here in Britain. And they would come here and they would tell their stories to the people here. And then what would happen is campaigns would build up around them. So one of the great abolitionists that we don't necessarily hear a lot of is a woman by the name of Mary Prince, who came here. She told her story, and European women gathered around her, and she became a pivotal figure in the abolition movement here. So one of the jobs that we as African people have to do in somewhere like Britain, this part of the diaspora, is we must plead the justice of our case, and we have got the difficult job of winning Europeans over to understanding the justice of our case. This is one of the good things that's happening at the moment, because the European children at the moment, the younger generation at the moment, are showing themselves to be much more open to understanding the wrongs of racism than the generations before. The classic term for the generations, people who are my age, older, and some people a bit younger than me also, you'd hear Europeans always saying, "Oh, I'm not racist. I'm not racist. My best friend is an African." Or they'll say statements to that kind of effect. They're in a state of denial They are blatantly racist, but they will pretend that they're not racist. So they can't even begin to solve the problem because they won't even recognize it. But what we've got in this generation is young people who are understanding, yes, they are contributors to racism, and they're taking active steps to try and overcome it. And it's African people that have got to show them that, because they're not capable of seeing it for themselves. They're just not capable. So one of our jobs is a diplomatic job of showing indigenous populations here, because we're based here, what their wrongs are, but to show it to them in a way that allows them to come onto the right side. So it's a really diplomatic thing, because the temptation is, of course, to slap them over the head with all the wrongs that they've done against us, and then they, naturally respond and become our enemies. So it's a very difficult balancing act that we've got to play. We've got to plead our case, and we've got to transform people here so that they do what is necessary to, bring down their governments, etc., bring down their state structures, etc., so that that part of the reinstatement of justice is taken care of. Because African people in Britain are too small in number to be, pretending that we can create revolution here in Britain. We're just too small in number to achieve that. But what we can do is we can show the justice of our cause to the people here who are besieged by racism, and we can encourage them to do the right thing. It is the masses in this country that will contribute to revolutionary change here, and we're just a small part of those masses. And in broader terms, I suppose what that means is that we are in the belly of the beast. And our job is to give the beast a bellyache. We can't necessarily kill the beast, because we just don't have sufficient power. There just aren't enough of us as African people to kill the beast. But as part of a broader collective, we can give the beast a bellyache and encourage its own people to bring it down. So I don't know if that's an adequate response to your question, my sister. But yeah, that's the response that I'd share in a public forum.
Thank you. I think this is the question coming. I can't see it in the post, so I think it's from Committee Cohesion. If you want to post it again.
Okay, so there possibly there are questions coming in, but it's not so straightforward to pick them out. Is that it?
Yeah, I don't see it in the feed.
Okay. Well, I mean, it's not compulsory that people ask questions. I mean, we can allow another, 2 or 3 minutes or so, and if people don't want to pose questions, that's fine. We can, bring the broadcast to a close. We're not obliged to, just keep going. And did you have any other questions whilst you were waiting, by the way?
I was wondering, you spoke obviously about the political and the industrialization of Africa. Mm-hmm. I was thinking, knowing that the education system that we are under here in the West, but also in Africa, on the continent, is the one imposed by the colonialists. How do you see, the younger generation coming together if they're being taught by their oppressors?
Yeah, the enemy will do whatever they can to maintain control of Africa, the richest continent in the world. They're not going to stop. They're going to use the education system. They're going to use war. They're going to use biological warfare. They're going to use, all kinds of methods. But the desire to be free is an innate desire in all human beings. Even confused human beings understand that we want to be free. Like any other human being, African people, are deciding, continue to decide that we want to be free. Now, what we have in our favor are our principles. And these are first people principles. And our principles are basically humanism. It's the cluster of humanist principles. And the essence of humanism is that people are more important than profit. People are more important than property. People are more important than money, and so on. The people are the highest priority. And in Africa, we still have that as the essential core principle of our people. This is also true for the Aborigines of Australia, who still have this as their core principle. It's also true of the American Indians. I'm talking about those that are left of the Aborigines and those that are left of the American Indians. They still have this as their core principle. This is the opposite principle to capitalism, to European imperialism, which goes by exploitation. Exploitation is the idea that profits are more important than people, that property is more important than people, that money is more important than people. And our principles, despite the ravages of the education system imposed by the colonizers, are still alive. Amilcar Cabral, one of our greats, tells us that African culture is still alive and strong in the villages. So our principles still exist. They still have a relative degree of strength in the villages, if not in the cities in Africa. Certainly they've been dissipated and eroded in the cities. But most of our population is still in the countryside. It's still in the villages. And it is our ability to maintain those principles that will see us through in the end. So I'm confident that despite the wickedness of imperialism, despite the wickedness of the colonizers and neo-colonizers, despite the indoctrination of the colonizers and neo-colonizers, that we will continue to prosper. We will overcome this problem. And remember, they are aged. I can't remember what the average age was for Europeans, for instance, but it's somewhere in the 40s. So they're coming to a period where they're dying out. The other thing that I didn't mention in the presentation, by the way, is that they're not reproducing themselves. And that's another factor which is causing European people now to reduce in numbers in the world. To reproduce ourselves, we must have, 2 children, basically. That's just to keep us on par. And the demographics show that Europeans are not producing 2 children, they're producing sort of 1.7 or that kind of figure. And when you do that, when you fail to reproduce yourself, at least 2 people to replace the 2 that have gone, that is, all generations have to die. So if you don't put 2 people there to replace the 2 that have gone, you're on a downward spiral, and a downward spiral to extinction. It may explain why there is such a zeal amongst some Europeans, not all, to see us killed off and culled. They possibly think that it will save them. It won't save them. It doesn't matter how many of us they kill. they won't save themselves by killing us. If they want to save themselves, they have to reproduce. They're failing to do that at the moment. So
Okay,
that's my response to that question. I don't know if any questions have come in that period.
Yes, we have a few now. So a question from Committee Cohesion. What is your view on the African Union ability to lead the diaspora?
The African Union is a disaster for Africa. It is really an institution controlled from the outside. It is not an institution genuinely controlled by African people. It is funded from outside in the main. And it makes decisions not for the advancement of African people, but instead is structured to make decisions that allow outside entities, multinationals in particular, to do as they please with Africa. So, and it's clear, we sit on the richest land in the world. We should be the richest people in the world. The equation is actually as simple as that. We're not the richest nation in the world. And so it's clear that at the very least, the African Union is incompetent. I would go further, and I would say that the African Union is structured, and I haven't got time to go into the history here. I have to go back to the history of the Organization of African States. But in this book here, by the way, I do explain. This book is Pan-Africanism, the Battlefront. And there's a chapter in there where I do explain why the OAU, the Organization of African Unity, which became the African Union, it transformed into the African Union, why it is bankrupt and why it was corrupted from the very moment that it came into being and has never been corrected. So the African Union, in its current construction, will not solve our problems because it's not designed to solve our problems. It's designed to keep our enemy, our colonial enemy, our neo-colonial enemy, in pole position in Africa. So that in general terms, is my view.
Okay. Another question from Clive Morrison. So, is it time now for our ambassadors from the diaspora to awake and demand collectively reparations for all the injustice suffered, in line with slave owners receiving compensation?
Yeah, I mean, that's very interesting. I mean, there can only be one answer to that, and that's yes. In very simple terms, that's the only answer there is. I mean, in this book here, African people abolished the slave trade. I identify a number of facts, and I can present facts for a long time to articulate this case. But I'll just use one. Yeah, if you go into Walter Rodney's book, and I've done it in that book, Walter Rodney's book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. He reproduces a table, and the table is a population census that happened in the 17th and 18th centuries. Now, I think it was, and I can't remember the dates off the top of my head, in about 1700, the population of Africa was approximately 100 million. I believe it was 103 million. The population of Europe was 100 million. So Africa and Europe had the same population I can't remember the exact date, but I'm saying 1700 as an indicator. And then when you fast forward 100 years, when you move forward 100 years, and you come to 1800, the population of Europe is 400 million people. And the population of Africa is 100 million people. Now, if you look at the family structures of African people and Europeans, if you look at family structures, you'll see that African people tend to have larger families than Europeans. So at the very least, the African population should have been 400 million also. Of course, it should have been much more than that because of our natural tendency to have larger families. So the question then becomes, where did all of those people go? We've lost at least 300 million African people. Where did they go? Now, if we don't deserve, you can't actually repair that because we're talking about the lives of our people that have been taken away. But if we don't have some kind of acknowledgement of that, which is not compensation even, but some kind of acknowledgement of that in the form of what we might generally term reparations, then it means that there is no justice in the world. So reparation is a must. We must have reparations, full stop. We must have reparations. There's a lot more that I could say on that subject, but I'll just go on for a long time. So let me stop there.
Okay. The next question from Valerie Dixon. How can we get our young Black people to understand liberation if they only know capitalism and imperialism, especially in the cities?
Yes, that's a very powerful question. Now, I do know the name Valerie Dixon, and I'm very honored that you're tuning in, my sister. Valerie Dixon, if it's the same Valerie Dixon that I'm thinking of, I think she is she may be the president of the UNIA in Jamaica. I'm not certain, but I think it may be her, or she may be a very senior figure in the UNIA in Jamaica, and I'm very grateful that you've taken the time to tune in and interact. Whether it's that Valerie Dixon or not, I'm very grateful that you've taken the time to tune in and interact. Yeah, again, I come back to the innate desire for freedom. You see, our young people, like the young people here in Europe, and in fact, I'm a product as well. I've been on this earth now for basically 60 years, and I have spent all of my life in capitalism. But I was opposed to capitalism even before I realized I was opposed to capitalism. I knew there was something wrong with it. And there are great signs because our children are showing us that they know that there's something wrong with it. Whether or not they understand the evils of capitalism, at a cerebral type level, is another issue. But their very actions of coming out onto the street in the way that they are, of demanding justice, means that they are seeing for themselves, they are feeling for themselves the injustices of capitalism. And they're looking for something better. Now, they may not know what that something better is at this stage. They may not be clear on what that something better is at this stage. But the fact that they are seeing that there's something wrong with what is in existence now is, such a positive that we must work with it. And so it is for those of us who have maybe through training, because most of us will have lived in capitalism. Well, all of us alive now will have lived in capitalism all of our lifetimes. But those of us who have been exposed to understandings of other systems, those of us who have been exposed to ideas that show that there are other ways of organizing. Socialism, for instance, is another way of organizing. So those of us that have been exposed to those other ways of organizing, we have a duty to share that information with our young people. Our young people are crying out for responses. They're crying out for answers. They're crying out for alternatives. They may not even accept what we show them, but they know that there are alternatives. So our duty is to explain alternative systems to our young people, to at least give them the option to move in another direction, to move in a direction other than capitalism. And we also have a duty to show the processes that are necessary to go through in order to leave capitalism behind and to move towards a future, which is socialism. And history shows us, it shows us that the natural progression from capitalism is socialism. The world is not going to remain in capitalism forever. And the next phase, the phase that comes after capitalism, is socialism, just as the phase that came before capitalism was feudalism. And the phase that came before feudalism was slavery. So as the tools change, I was talking about the tools earlier on, as the tools change, one of the things that happens is they change the phases of history. So I'm confident, to come back to the question that was raised, I'm confident that even though we have been immersed in capitalism for the entirety of our lifetime, I'm confident that that we will be able to overcome capitalism, and that our children will overcome capitalism in order to move on to a new social system, which history informs us will be socialism. The other thing that I'll say is this, is that in those nations that have made that transition, and there are examples, we've seen, the Soviet Union came into existence. It doesn't exist anymore, but it did come into existence. We saw China make that transition. Chinese, it's questionable whether China's following a socialist path at the moment. There are big debates going on around that, but it did go through a transition. When they went through those transitions, Cuba is another example, when they went through those transitions, nobody in those nations had experienced anything other than basically feudalism in those societies. So people were able to make that transformation to a new type of society, even though all that they had experienced was, the primitive version of capitalism. So I remain optimistic, well, somebody my age, what I can do, I hope, is make a contribution to helping our children understand, the phases and actions necessary in order to move from this current wicked system called capitalism to a more advanced and better one. So that's my response, my general public response to that question.
The next question is from Patricia Palmer. What, in your view, would be the first things that Africans in the diaspora need to do to reclaim their human principles?
Right. Oh, that's interesting, isn't it? That's interesting. Yeah. Yes. You know, our humanist principles haven't been lost. We've been battered so hard that now we're starting to do some very strange things. But humanism is really about, you know, your love of your fellow people. It is the love of humanity. It is putting people first. And when you're immersed in a system that puts people last, and in fact puts a small clique first, puts the profits of a small clique first, you must actually remove that system in order to create an environment where people can be put first. So the first thing to do is to, as I said before, be a part of organized forces, be a part of organization. And, you know, those organized forces need to be working genuinely for the liberation of African people. That's the first thing our young people need to do. And so, you know, older people like myself need to be working, you know, with our young people to create those organizations. They will lead their own organizations. And what they need from us is the experience that they haven't yet developed. You know, I hope to make some sort of a contribution in that way. Certainly in the organization work that I'm attempting to do at the moment, it will be about helping the organizations of young people to move forward. That's my response. Yeah.
Another question from Patricia Palmer, I think is the last question.
Okay.
What are the issues for African heritage people in the diaspora who have inherited Caribbean, African American, Black British norms, custom, traditions, and values?
This is interesting. You know, I actually like the approach of one of our great ancestors, whose name we don't often hear. His name is Amilcar Cabral. Amilcar Cabral was the revolutionary leader of the people of Guinea-Bissau. Guinea-Bissau is a small make-believe state, really, in West Africa, because we have these make-believe jigsaw puzzle states all over Africa. But when they were fighting for their independence under his leadership and his organization, the PAIGC it was called, when they were fighting for their independence, they were very clear that the liberation war itself was an act of culture. He makes it very clear that if you want to restore your culture, because culture is at the base of the question that's been asked, you must go through the liberation process. And then when you go through the liberation process, what you do is you clear the path to allow your culture space in order to develop and grow along its proper trajectory. The problem that we have at the moment is because we don't even control our own land in Africa. We don't even control it. IMF has more control over it than us. We don't control the islands in the Caribbean. IMF has more control over them than we do. We seem to be like almost tenants in our own land, with other people having a controlling interest. And when other people have a controlling interest, they can tell you what to do. If somebody controls the house that you live in, they can put limits on you and tell you what to do. You must first make the house yours That's the act of liberation. And then when you have taken control of the house and made it yours, you can then decorate it how you like. You can then arrange the house how you like. You can paint that outside of the house whatever color you like. The inside, make the decor however you want it to be. So the first act, the act of liberation, is the first act of culture for people in our position. And when we've cleared away the enemy that prevents us from expressing our culture, we must clear them out the path. And when we clear them out the path, what will happen is our culture will naturally begin to arise. The other way around doesn't work. And we know it doesn't work because this is the story of one example that's often quoted is Black Wall Street, for instance. African people were very successful in those roads in Oklahoma, a district, the Greenwood district of Oklahoma. And African culture was flourishing. All of this was happening at the same time as the Harlem Renaissance in New York. African culture was flourishing. And then all that happened was those who had more power in that land came and dropped bombs on it, started to kill African people. And then all of a sudden, the flourishing, the blooming culture that we had, that was developing in the early 1920s in New York and other parts, was just, in many respects, brought to a very rapid halt. And so Marcus Garvey himself explained to us, because he lived through that as well, he explained to us that if we want to, our culture to flourish, what we must do is we must go to Africa and we must build from our land. It doesn't mean that everybody has to go to Africa. Some can stay in the diaspora, but we must go to Africa. We must control our land. We must build our culture. And then what will happen is our culture will be rebuilt in its center, which is Africa. And then Africa will be in a position to protect African people wherever they are in the world. So whilst we are being killed in police custody, you never hear of a Chinese being killed in police custody. I've never heard of this. I've worked on deaths in custody campaigns supporting families whose loved ones have been lost. Just murdered. I say lost, just murdered by the British state. Over the past more than 20 years now, I've been involved in those campaigns. We've never had to, console Chinese people, I'm glad to say, because they have a strong government, a strong state, and if you kill a Chinese, there's a consequence. But if you kill an African, A, the African doesn't know that they're African, and B, the African nations don't know that the African that's been killed is an African. And we're just left up in the lurch. Now, I have to say, as a qualifier, that with George Floyd, that seems to be changing. I've seen examples of the African jigsaw puzzle states at least making noises, positive noises, complaining about the murder of George Floyd, and I hope that they continue to do that before they abolish themselves and replace themselves with a unified state. So the essence of the response is this, that the liberation is an act of culture. We must liberate ourselves, and that will free the rest of our culture. That will allow the space for the rest of our culture to flourish and bloom. And we will bloom like a flower when we do that. So that's my response.
Thank you. So far, no more questions.
Okay. Well, I think it just remains to say thank you in that case. to say thank you to everybody that took time to listen. I mean, we don't want to keep people, too long. So thank you to everybody that took time to listen this evening. We're working under lockdown conditions, and so it means that this is not the easiest of things to set up. I want to give my thanks to the members of our organisation that have worked tirelessly to ensure that this happened successfully this evening. Thank you to all of you for the work that you've put in. Thank you to all of the organisations that have supported this evening. Most of all, thank you to all of you that took time to listen in and just be part of this evening's conversation. Maybe as things move forward, we'll be able to make the line just a completely live line that people can just come in on and ask their questions directly. So it's just to say a big thank you. Thank you to you all. And I'm going to end the broadcast at this point. Given that we're in COVID period, it means that I've got to end it myself. So good night to everyone.